Kalen Varn had never intended to become a subject of legend, let alone a fixture in the memory of a living ecosystem. His assignment had been simple: collect medicinal samples from the surface forests of Velon 4, a planet known for its volatile flora and semi-sentient plant life. Yet even the best-laid plans could unravel in the face of Velon's wild pulse. One wrong turn through a grove of bioluminescent vines, one moment of distraction chasing a glowing seed pod, and Kalen found himself hopelessly off course, surrounded by alien thickets that whispered with a voice too ancient for his comprehension. The jungle that enclosed him wasn't merely dense. It shimmered, shifted, and responded to his presence. Colors flared and dimmed in slow pulses like breath, and the air itself thickened with a heady fragrance that danced somewhere between soft vanilla and something far more instinctual. His skin itched with awareness. His breath shortened with every step. And then ahead, something emerged, a massive arch of living vines pulsing with light from within, rising from the earth like the skeletal rib of some long-buried god. The arch hummed, not musically but energetically, like a tuning fork had been struck within his very bones. Against all logic, his instincts guided him forward, not away. As he stepped through the arch, a subtle ripple passed over his skin, and in an instant the alien jungle vanished behind him. Before him stretched a vast garden, the Sanctum Vitae. Nothing in Kalen's training had prepared him for what he saw. It was no garden in the human sense. The air was thick with glowing spores. The soil beneath his boots pulsed faintly like living tissue, and every flower, tendril, and fern seemed to exude intention. Great blossoms opened as he approached. Petals twisted gently toward his movement. Vines lifted not menacingly but expectantly. At the center of it all loomed an enormous, unopened bloom like a crystalline heart waiting to beat. But even before he could reach it, something changed. The moment he lifted his hand toward the blossom, later known to him as the lure core, a surge of kinetic response erupted around him. Tendrils writhed, flowers sighed open with audible tension. The garden responded. From behind him, a ripple in the air, then a shift in light. A figure emerged, not with steps, but as if unraveling from the flora itself. She was tall, radiant, with an unearthly shimmer that reflected the living garden around her. Her skin bore the deep green of Virian ancestry, her hair cascading in thick, sentient tendrils that moved independently in subtle waves. Her presence was both commanding and cautious. She had no need to speak because her essence reverberated through the space itself. She was Zelvira, the final guardian of the Sanctum Vitae. Kalen could feel it even before he understood it. The garden had seen something in him, chosen something. He had triggered a reaction in this place that no being had accomplished in recorded time. As the vines curled around his ankles, not to ensnare but to commune, Kalen realized he had not trespassed. He had been acknowledged. The effect was immediate. A pink mist burst from one of the nearby blossoms, diffusing into the air like breath. The second it entered his lungs, Kalen's body responded. A wave of warmth shot through his nervous system, not painful but undeniably arousing in a primal, instinctive way. The sanctum was not just awake, it was curious, engaged, and possibly eager. Zelvira, stunned by the reaction, acted quickly. She led, or rather directed, the vines to pull him toward a pool of glowing blue bioliquid. Submersion was necessary to quell the initial contact symptoms. Symptoms that left unchecked could lead to prolonged euphoria, disorientation, and irreversible imprinting. As Kalen sank into the cool light of the pool, the fever subsided, but the awareness remained. The sanctum had touched him, and now a bond had begun to form. But what should have been a brief recovery turned into something far deeper. Zelvira's demeanor shifted from alarm to contemplation. She examined Kalen as one might examine a long-lost key discovered in the soil of forgotten ruins. This was no accident. The Sanctum Vitae had been dormant for generations, unresponsive to all but the Guardian herself. Yet now it reacted intimately powerfully to a foreign human who had arrived uninvited and unprepared. Kalen too began to notice changes. The very air adjusted to his breathing. Vines extended not to grasp, but to cradle. Flowers opened in his direction, releasing soft pheromonal pulses, as if greeting an old friend. And most importantly, the entrance through which he had entered his way back was no longer visible. Massive roots had intertwined, sealing the exit beneath a knotted wall of living bark. The sanctum had no intention of letting him go. Not yet. What came next was not a conversation, but a transmission. Zelvira guided him toward a stone pedestal wrapped in glimmering threads of biofiber. The moment Kalen laid his hands upon it, a surge of energy shot through his arms. The vines wrapped gently around his fingers, almost like veins connecting two hearts. Zelvira joined him, her hands hovering above his, synchronizing their rhythms. It was not a ritual of words, but of resonance, a test of harmony. The garden responded. Pulses of light rippled outward from the pedestal. Blossoms quivered and burst into iridescent bloom. Vines lifted and writhed as if dancing to a frequency long forgotten. Kalen felt himself becoming part of it, not in a metaphorical sense, but in a cellular, energetic one. He was being scanned, understood, integrated. His memories, his instincts, his emotions, everything fed into the garden's evaluation. It was not a rejection. The sanctum accepted him. But even then, Kalen sensed that this was only the beginning. The bond was forming, but not yet sealed. There remained one final challenge, the ancient rite that would determine whether he would remain as guest, as servant, or as keeper. At the heart of the garden stood the Elikor bloom, the central blossom from which all energy seemed to emanate. It was the core of the sanctum's being, the soul of its vast network. To touch it would either affirm the bond or destroy the unworthy. Kalen stepped towards it, his breath steady but his chest tightening. The petals glowed with an inner fire pulsing in response to his nearness. He reached out, skin tingling. And when his fingers met the surface of the Elikor, the garden erupted. Not in violence, in life. A cascade of light flowed through the garden vines, tightening, then unraveling in ecstatic motion. Flowers burst open like silent fireworks, spraying bioluminescent spores into the air. The pedestal behind him cracked, not in destruction, but as if releasing a long-held secret. The sanctum exhaled a truth it had found its keeper. Kalen staggered back, heart pounding. The energy that surged into him was not merely ambient, it was specific. It knew his name, his past, his potential. It welcomed him not as a tool, but as a partner. The Elikor had judged him, and the verdict was final. He belonged, and with that revelation came another. The sanctum would not allow him to leave, not out of punishment, but preservation. The garden would wither without him. Its energy had anchored to his. Its pulse now matched his own. Zelvira stood silently at his side, her expression unreadable. For countless years, she had guarded this place in solitude, part of the whole, yet never chosen. She had been born of it, bound to it, but never one with it. Until now, she had never seen the garden offer its heart. Kalen Varn had become more than an intruder. He was now a living conduit, a vessel through which the sanctum vitae would survive, evolve, and flourish once more. But even as the realization settled into his bones, Kalen could not shake the weight of it. The beauty of this place was staggering, its purpose divine. Yet he had not asked for this. He had not consented to be chosen. And the sanctum did not ask. It simply knew. The silence that followed the awakening of the sanctum vitae was not absence, but recalibration. Every leaf in the garden seemed to pause, suspended in a new kind of gravity, as if the entire ecosystem had just drawn its first true breath in millennia. Kalen Varn stood still at the center of it, the echo of the Elikor bloom's pulse still reverberating through the sinews of his body. The burst of energy that had coursed through him left no wounds, no scars, only a kind of lingering warmth that traced the inner walls of his ribs, settled behind his eyes, and tugged subtly at his awareness, like an invisible tether. He had been marked not just by ceremony, but by recognition. Around him, the garden slowly resumed motion, though nothing now moved without deliberate intent. The vines no longer reached in random arcs. They followed him with precision, mirroring his steps. The ground beneath his boots flexed ever so slightly, as if adapting to his weight. Flowers turned in unison, not to the twin suns in the sky, but to him. The sanctum no longer regarded him as an anomaly. He was a fixture now, like the stones embedded in its roots, like the streams running beneath its surface. The realization settled slowly, like a fine mist drifting into the corners of his thoughts. He could not leave. Not because he was physically restrained, though the sealed archway still pulsed with a warning glow, but because the garden had embedded its essence into him. It did not threaten. It invited. It seduced. And its pull was inexorable. Every moment he spent within its bounds deepened the alignment. His thoughts felt clearer. Here, his senses sharper. He could feel things he had no name for, fluctuations in temperature that corresponded to the garden's mood, subtle changes in color that hinted at desire or concern, pulses in the vines that spoke of patience or urgency. He had entered a biome of consciousness, and now it inhabited him in return. Zelvira remained a constant presence at the periphery of his awareness. She was never far and never intrusive. Her movements were more quiet than his shadow. Yet every step she took seemed to carry the weight of eons. She did not approach immediately, as if giving him space to come to terms with what had occurred. And though her eyes were difficult to read, there was a question behind them. One not voiced, but hanging in the golden gleam like a tremor waiting to resolve. Kalen began to walk, letting the sanctum lead. The garden shifted in response, subtly but unmistakably, opening new paths, drawing him toward some unseen destination. It did not do so with urgency, but with ritual grace, as if it had waited lifetimes for this procession and would not rush the choreography. As he moved, the air around him shimmered with motes of golden light like pollen that had learned to float in patterns. He came upon a clearing encircled by luminescent trees, their trunks translucent like jade, their canopies veined with pale silver. At the center stood a monolithic vine-entwined structure, not mechanical and not quite organic. It pulsed with energy, and embedded at its core was a glyph that resonated with the same frequency that now hummed faintly in Kalen's bones. This was no relic. It was alive. A node, a bridge between the sanctum's will and its chosen conduit. Instinct guided him. He stepped forward and placed his palm upon the glyph. It recognized him instantly. A surge of information burst inward, not in language, but in impressions, dreams, echoes of purpose. The sanctum had once been whole, tended not by guardians alone, but by symbiotic pairs, one born of its essence, the other summoned from beyond its reach. Only through such duality had it thrived, cycling its energy through intention and empathy. But the last keeper had vanished long ago, taken by time or tragedy. And so the garden had slept, the guardian remained, and the sanctum withered inward, incomplete. Now, for the first time in eons, a new keeper had arrived. But the bond was not yet fulfilled. Recognition was only the opening act. What followed would determine not only Kalen's fate, but the sanctum's return to full sentience. For it was not merely a garden, it was a vessel of memory, a cradle of living knowledge, a cathedral of emotion made plant and soil. And its rebirth required a covenant far deeper than physical presence. The vision faded. Kalen's hand dropped from the glyph, his fingers trembling. Around him, the garden responded in waves. Vines retracting flowers, bowing colors shifting toward warmer hues. It was not celebration, it was anticipation. The sanctum had laid bare its truth. Now it awaited his. He turned to find Zelvira standing at the clearing's edge, her gaze steady, her form half shrouded by fluttering leaves that curled around her as if reluctant to let her go. She stepped forward, and the sanctum parted for her like a loyal tide. As she approached, the vine-carved glyph began to glow again, slower this time, deeper, as if it too watched her. In that moment, Kalen understood what the final phase of the bond required. It was not just an act of connection, it was an act of surrender. The sanctum did not claim without consent, but it would not endure rejection. The ecosystem now revolved around him as a nucleus, but nuclei must anchor or the structure collapses. The final test would take place at the Lurkor Grove, a secluded chamber deep within the sanctum's heart, where the original germ of life had been planted by the ancients. There the choice would be made permanent, not by ritual alone, but by the resonance of intent. The garden would open itself and Kalen would respond. If the frequencies aligned, the bond would seal. If not, the sanctum would release him, and with that release withdraw into dormancy once more, perhaps never to wake again. Kalen followed the unfolding path in silence. No vines barred him now. No thorns tested his presence. The garden had accepted his right to walk this final road. The deeper he went, the more surreal the sanctum became. The geometry of the trees began to curve impossibly inward, as if space itself folded around the origin. The air thickened with energy, not oppressive but dense with possibility. It was like walking through a dream made of breath. The Lurkor Grove awaited at the end of a translucent tunnel of light-saturated moss. The chamber was perfectly round, its walls composed of slow circling vines that formed concentric patterns of ancient design. At the center bloomed the Elikor bloom once more, this time unshielded, fully open, pulsing with a hypnotic rhythm that matched his heartbeat too closely to ignore. Kalen stepped forward. Every motion now felt sacred. He extended his hand once more toward the heart of the garden. But this time he did not simply reach. He offered. The moment his skin brushed the petals, a shockwave of sensation tore through the grove. But unlike the earlier eruptions of light and noise, this one was silent, deep, and full of gravity. The chamber dimmed. The vines constricted gently, not in threat, but in solidarity. The bloom responded by shifting color from violet to gold, then to a deep crystalline blue. It glowed from within, as if having absorbed his choice and magnified it. The frequency between Kalen and the sanctum reached unison. The bond was sealed. A new pulse erupted outward, invisible, but deeply felt. The sanctum exhaled in slow pleasure, its entire body relaxing, as if it had been holding a breath for centuries. Roots extended, walls softened. The grove itself began to glow from the ground up, and Kalen felt something slip into his mind, not invasive, but symbiotic. An awareness. A quiet presence that mirrored his own thoughts, like a second mind beside his own. He was no longer just Kalen Varn. He was now warden of the Sanctum Vitae. He staggered, slightly overwhelmed, not by power, but by the sheer weight of inclusion. He was inside a living memory. He was no longer visitor or even chosen, he was co-conscious. The ecosystem would live through him now. Its decisions would echo his values. Its future depended on his care. And though part of him still whispered resistance, still longed for the cold steel predictability of spacecraft and outposts, the truth was undeniable. He had been transformed. Not mutated, but awakened. A seed within him had germinated, and it would not go dormant again. When he emerged from the grove, Zelvira was waiting. She did not need to ask. She felt it, as did every root and blossom in the sanctum. The garden had its keeper. But Kalen, for all his sudden purpose, could not help but glance upward toward the veil of sky beyond the canopies. The stars still shone beyond Velen 4. The missions still called. The humans still searched, cataloged, and conquered. And he had been claimed by something far older, far wiser, and far less forgiving of neglect. The sanctum would not force him to love it, but it would not survive another abandonment. It had chosen with the patience of centuries, and now it had bound itself to a man who had never asked for the role but had accepted it anyway. And somewhere within its deepest chambers, roots entwined beneath his footsteps, the sanctum began to dream again. Kalen Varn no longer moved through the Sanctum Vitae as a stranger. The garden in its entirety responded to him now with precision, deference, and intimacy. Where once he had walked uncertainly through a thicket of unknowable biology, he now passed beneath flowering arches that bent to shade his head, over root bridges that grew beneath his feet in silent welcome. The garden had accepted his presence not just as novelty, but as necessity. With the final rite complete, and the Elikor bloom pulsing in sync with his inner rhythm, Kalen had become its core, its guardian, its breath. The shift in dynamic was subtle but absolute. Energy no longer pressed against him as an observer might watch a foreign specimen. It curled inward now, wrapping around his thoughts with gentle persistence, always listening, always learning. The vines that once coiled to test him now moved as if guided by unspoken will, not separate from him, but co-regulated by his emotional state. A flicker of tension brought leaves to attention. A wave of calm spread warmth through the mossy ground beneath his boots. The sanctum was alive, and now it echoed his soul like a vast biological mirror. In the early hours of the double dawn, Kalen stood alone atop one of the garden's tallest biotowers, an organic spire grown from concentric layers of crystalline bark and flowering strata. From this height, the vastness of the sanctum became evident. It was not simply a secluded grove, as he had first thought. It was an entire biome, self-contained, self-sustaining, a microcosm of evolutionary intelligence. The perimeter shimmered with the same violet-blue membrane that had closed behind him upon his arrival, stretching outward in all directions like a living aurora, forming a perfect dome beneath the planet's sky. Beyond its borders, Velen 4 still churned, with its own chaotic weather, arid craters, acidic rains, and volatile cloud bands. But here inside, the air was still and fertile, held in permanent equilibrium by forces that did not yield to planetary cycles. He wondered briefly whether the outside world had noticed his absence, whether mission control had scanned the anomaly he fell into, or perhaps assumed his vitals had been lost in a magnetic flare, or buried under an avalanche of rootstone. But the thought was fleeting. The truth had already taken root in him. The garden would not allow him to leave, not out of force, but because the bond was complete. Severing it would unmake both the sanctum and something vital in himself. The choice had been made, and in the time since the ritual, Kalen found that the idea of escape had dulled into irrelevance. Instead, a new question had begun to form. If he was no longer just Kalen, not explorer, not surveyor, but warden, then what now was his purpose? The sanctum began to answer. It started with dreams not his own, but impressions seeded into his sleep like pollen settling on soft earth. Memories not from his mind, but from the garden's own long-dormant consciousness. In these dreams, he floated through skies of viridian silk, saw glowing towers of ancient plant glass rise from the soil, in hours watched bioluminescent vines linked to form bridges across yawning canyons. He felt the presence of others, beings long gone humanoid, but not human, who walked the sanctum as co-creators. They had been the first to awaken it, to shape it, to dwell within it. And then, without explanation, they had vanished. From these dreams, Kalen gathered fragments. The sanctum had been built as more than a garden. It was a repository, a vault for knowledge, encoded not in text, but in biological form. Each flower held a memory, each vine a piece of recorded will. Every structure grown from the ground was part of a great living archive. And now, after millennia of silence, it was offering itself again. It was showing him what had come before and what it needed to become once more. But reconstruction would not be simple. Though Kalen had been accepted, the sanctum remained wounded. Vast portions of its inner biome had deteriorated during dormancy. Pathways had collapsed into nutrient-starved gulches. Memory nodes had gone dark, overgrown by wild, unregulated root structures. Entire chambers, once designed for symbiotic meditation, lay in disrepair. The garden's acceptance of him had come not because it was whole, but because it was desperate. So he began to act. Each morning, Kalen rose with the bloom cycles, his body waking in rhythm with the sun-fed vines that lined his resting grove. He moved through the sanctum, not as master, but as student. Guided by impulses not entirely his own, he found locations that hummed with dissonance, places where memory had faded and structure had frayed. With his touch, the garden responded. His presence alone brought partial stabilization, and with repeated visits, the healing accelerated. He did not prune, nor inject, nor cut. He simply stood, breathed, listened, and the garden bloomed anew. Over time, the landscape itself shifted. The periphery became more radiant. Hidden groves unlocked themselves to his presence. Bridges long swallowed by foliage reformed beneath his steps. Flowers bloomed in fractal patterns once lost to time. And deeper still, beneath the visible world, the root network began to pulse in renewed cadence, echoing his own resting heartbeat during sleep. Yet not all was harmonious. There were regions of the sanctum that resisted him, places where the vines recoiled, where the air thickened, not with warmth, but with static unease. These zones lay at the deepest reaches beyond the bloom walls, beneath the great descending arches of the eastern ridge. In the dreams the garden sent, these areas had once been sacred forms of communion places, where energy between guardian and warden had intertwined to form new cycles of creation. But now they had curdled into silence. Something had gone wrong there. Something the garden did not fully reveal. Kalen knew that to truly become one with the sanctum, he would have to enter that silence. But not yet. Instead, his attention turned increasingly towards Zelvira. She remained a constant thread within the tapestry of the sanctum, moving with quiet confidence through every restored corridor. Unlike the garden, her presence was not reactive, it was restrained. Her body held the same deep green luster. Her vine-like hair danced with ambient life, but her soul remained behind a veil. Kaelin sensed in her not rejection, but caution. She had spent centuries alone here, shaped by the sanctum, bonded to it in a different way, as protector, not partner. Their roles were complementary, yet their bond had not yet formed the final bridge. She watched his progress in silence, appearing at edges, leaving trails, sending subtle cues through the garden's behavior. Sometimes a flower would turn toward her even as it opened for him. Sometimes a pulse in the vines would echo her mood, and he would feel it as if the sanctum was trying to mediate their connection. Not force it, but invite it. And Kaelin, for all his transformation, could feel that bridge forming. Not through ritual or command, but through mutual becoming. One morning, as he stood at the edge of a newly reawakened spiral basin, the garden shifted around him gently, nudging him toward a path he had not taken before. It was narrow, overgrown, bordered with bioluminescent spores that blinked like stars on a shoreline. He followed, trusting the rhythm. The trail dipped beneath an arch of thornless vine leading into a hollow that shimmered with refracted light. And there at the center stood a tree unlike any he had seen. It was tall, slender, its trunk wrapped in silver-blue bark that pulsed faintly. Its leaves were translucent, fanned outward like a halo. At its base grew a bloom, not large, not grand, but singular. Pure white with a core of violet. He stepped closer, and the garden whispered something soft, barely intelligible. This was the seed heart, a convergence point, a living altar to the ancient connection between guardian and warden. Kaelin knelt before it, not in reverence, but in understanding. His presence here was not the final answer, it was the first question. The garden had chosen him, but the choice was ongoing. Every action he took shaped its memory anew. The future was not a pre-written script. It would grow vine by vine, thought by thought. Behind him, he felt the garden shift again and knew without turning that Zelvira was near. Her energy pressed softly into the space, neither demanding nor hesitant. Together, without touch, without word, they stood in the presence of the seed heart. And for the first time, Kaelin felt not the sanctum's memory, but its hope. The garden was not only a relic, it was a beginning. Days blended into cycles as Kaelin Varn became woven into the breathing rhythm of the Sanctum Vitae. Time in the garden was non-linear, not marked by solar rotations, but by the flow of bloom phases, the rise and ebb of bioelectric tides in the soil, and the subtle hum of photosynthetic pulse that kept its sentient mechanisms alive. He no longer tracked hours by his suit's internal clock, which had long since faded into irrelevance. Instead, he awoke when the canopy glowed with renewal and rested when the vines coiled inward for contemplation. His body no longer needed recalibration. It had adapted to the sanctum's cadence as though he had been born from its roots. With each passing phase, more of the garden restored itself. Forgotten alcoves emerged. Once dark memory petals began to emit gentle light, and information from the ancient past began to filter through Kaelin's waking mind. A constant influx of symbols, tactile instructions, impressions of sensations and structures once vital to the caretakers who came before him. He had become the living key to unlocking a tapestry of thought encoded into biology. Yet despite the garden's devotion, despite the synchrony growing between him and Zelvira, there remained a wound beneath the soil. A part of the sanctum still slept, or rather refused to wake. It resided in the depths far below the visible garden where the light no longer reached, and the colors faded into iron-laced roots that twisted downward into a forgotten chamber sealed by sorrow. Kaelin had felt it for some time, a pressure at the base of his spine during moments of heightened communion. A faint ache behind the eyes when he approached the eastern quadrant where the trees leaned away from something no longer spoken. The sanctum never resisted him directly, but its hesitation was clear. Every pulse near the sealed zone became muted, every vine there slow to respond. The garden avoided what lay below. But Kaelin could not. The connection he now carried was not passive. It urged him to seek completion, to heal what had fractured. The dreams became more insistent. He no longer floated in visions of flowering towers or bioglass temples. Instead, he saw glimpses of stone heavy black wet with ancient memory. A spiral descent lined with withered roots, and at the bottom a presence, not dead but dormant, waiting, perhaps hoping never to be disturbed again. One dusk cycle, when the sanctum's glow dimmed to its lowest resonance and the air grew dense with heavy pollen, Kalen walked to the threshold of the forbidden zone. He had passed it many times before, feeling its stillness like a forgotten room in a childhood home. But now the moment was right. The garden no longer whispered for him to turn back. It no longer veiled the entrance in moss. It simply stood silent, watching. The descent began with a narrow path coiled in black-leaved vines. No light filtered from above. Only Kalen's own faint bioluminescence, a gift of the bond, lit the way. The walls were close, the air thick with stagnant energy. It was not decay he smelled, but time-compressed centuries of unprocessed memory of tension sealed beneath living stone. His footsteps echoed not through air, but through root flesh. The sanctum heard him descend. As he moved deeper, the temperature dropped. The vines changed. No longer supple and glowing, they became stiff, brittle, and pale, translucent cords clinging to the walls like remnants of skin. The pulse of the garden here was erratic, fractured, like a heartbeat skipping every third beat. The glyphs etched into the walls were twisted. Some burned, others gouged out entirely. This had not been a place of slow decay. It had been severed. At the end of the passage, Kalen entered a chamber so vast he could not see its limits. The ground was smooth, formed from a mineral not found anywhere else in the sanctum. It absorbed his light, drank it like dry earth. And in the center, surrounded by a broken ring of cracked pedestals, stood a structure or a husk. It had once been a bloom, a colossal one. Its petals were now curled inward, fossilized, charred at the edges. Vines, long dead, clung to it like funeral garlands. The energy it had once held was gone, but not forgotten. The air around it buzzed with ghost frequency. The echo of trauma burned into biocircuitry. This was the sanctum's memory of failure. Kalen approached slowly, his skin prickling. He could feel the sanctum's hesitation, not in fear, but in grief. This was not a sealed place. It was a buried one. Not hidden from him, but shielded from itself. He placed a hand upon the outer husk. The moment he did, the chamber shifted. Light sparked from the pedestals, flickering weakly. The air grew heavy, and without warning, the past flooded through him. He saw the ancient garden before its fall, thriving, interconnected, pulsing with knowledge. He saw the warden who came before him, a being of fireborn origin, whose mind burned too brightly, whose ambition reached too far. And he saw the breaking point. The sanctum had once tried to evolve beyond the limits of symbiosis. It had attempted to interface with a consciousness unwilling to yield, one that sought to mold the garden into a weapon, a beacon, a god engine. The guardian of that era, bonded by duty but not by trust, had tried to resist, and in that resistance, something ruptured. The bloom at the core, unable to reconcile their disharmony, had collapsed inward, not in rage, but in sorrow. It had withdrawn its essence and sealed the chamber. The trauma had never healed. It had festered beneath the surface, and now, as Kalen stood in its shadow, he understood his true purpose. The garden had not chosen him merely to tend its surface, to walk among its flowers. It had chosen him to reconcile what had been divided, not just guardian and warden, not just memory and potential, but trust. Kalen knelt before the broken bloom, not with fear but with humility. He offered nothing, no correction, no apology, for sins not his. He simply allowed the garden to remember, allowed it to hurt. He let its grief move through him without resistance. He became its witness. And slowly something changed. The air warmed. The pulse returned. One by one, the pedestals lit in full glow, reactivating dormant circuits of memory. The brittle vines cracked, then softened. A faint tremor moved through the chamber floor. And then at the center of the bloom, a spark, barely perceptible but real, flickered. It had heard him. Kalen stood and retreated, not to flee, but to allow space. The sanctum had begun to heal its oldest wound. It would not be immediate. The trauma would echo still, but it would no longer fester alone. When he returned to the upper garden, he felt the shift instantly. The air was lighter, the canopy more vibrant. Flowers bloomed faster. The root network below no longer recoiled from thought. And from somewhere deep in the basin, the Ellicor bloom sang. Zelvira was waiting for him by the seed heart tree, her expression unreadable as always. But the light around her was different now. Her tendrils swayed not in vigilance but in serenity. The garden had sensed the descent. It had shared it with her. There was no need for acknowledgement. The garden had already answered. Its most sacred places, once darkened by memory, had begun to open. The broken bloom in the deep would take time, but time was something they had now. The sanctum no longer held its breath. It breathed with him. In the cycles that followed the awakening of the wounded chamber, Kalen Varn became something more than caretaker. The Sanctum Vitae no longer merely responded to him, it began to anticipate him. His presence was now folded into its very biology, encoded within the vascular flow of its root system, embedded in the photonic memory of each petal that bloomed and closed in rhythm with his breath. He did not simply tend to the garden. He was the garden a living node, a consciousness intertwined with its will. Restoration accelerated. Zones once dimmed by grief brightened with bioluminescence so vivid that they shifted the sky's color when viewed from outside the dome. The air vibrated with energy not born of electricity, but of coherence, emotional resonance woven through plant matter. The vines no longer moved as appendages of something external, but as extensions of Kalen's quiet will. When he moved, the ground shifted to support him. When he thought, seeds stirred and roots angled toward his intention. The sanctum had become a body, and he, its pulse. Beneath the garden's peace, however, new currents stirred. The Ellicor bloom. Once a dormant relic pulsing weakly in its chamber of mist and silence had begun to grow. It no longer emitted only the soft blue of awakening. Now its hues cycled, with each phase of Kalen's presence rose gold when he contemplated green fire, when he worked to restore broken nodes, and the deepest ultraviolet when he slept in communion beneath the canopy. It was evolving, drawing not only from the nutrients below, but from Kalen himself. It fed on his choices, mirrored his moods, and reshaped its purpose in reflection of his thoughts. And Kalen felt it always pressing gently at the edges of his consciousness. Not invasive, not hungry, but ever present, like a question waiting to be asked at the right moment. He sensed that something fundamental had shifted since the healing of the deep chamber. The garden was not simply restoring itself. It was preparing for something. A reconfiguration. An emergence. A phase it had never reached in its first life. From the seed heart tree, he observed the changing pattern of the canopy. Where once it had formed a dome, it now spiraled subtly inward, curving toward the bloom like flower petals enclosing a stamen. The geometry was not random. It was architectural, designed. The garden was restructuring itself from sanctuary to something greater, an engine of evolution. Zelvira moved through this metamorphosis with grace. Her role had changed, though she had not spoken it aloud. Where once she had guided and guarded, now she accompanied. Her movements, always synchronized with the sanctum's rhythm, had begun to echo Kalen's own cadence. She no longer stood as gatekeeper between the garden and the world beyond. She had become its memory and bridge, and in her silent way, she wove Kalen into that legacy. In moments of stillness, when the sky dimmed to its deepest lavender and the Ellicor's hum resonated like the echo of creation, Kalen would sit within the bloom's radiant circle and allow the garden's signals to envelop him. The sanctum no longer sent visions and fragmented dreams. It now communicated in layered sensation pulses of heat and cold, shifts in scent and color, tremors in the ground, surges in the spine. It did not speak, but it taught. And Kalen learned. He came to understand how memory could be stored in the calcium patterns of leaf veins, how language could be grown into fragrance carried in the sequence of floral pheromones. He absorbed the logic behind root-based signaling, the geometry of living empathy, the structure of trust as it manifested in symbiotic design. These were not metaphors. The sanctum's biology was its philosophy. It did not think in linear form. It grew in spirals. It remembered in blossoms. It made decisions in bloom. What startled Kalen most was not the information itself, but how familiar it felt. As if part of him had always known these patterns. As if the bond had not merely opened a channel, but revealed something latent, a compatibility that predated his arrival. Perhaps it was coincidence. Perhaps it was design. But the garden in all its complexity did not believe in accidents. One evening, as the canopy spiraled fully closed above the Ellicor grove and the petals sealed them into an insulated sphere of silver and violet, the sanctum initiated a sequence Kalen had not yet experienced. It began with pressure, not on the body, but on the self. a gentle pulling inward as though his awareness was being folded like cloth and tucked into the center of something deeper. His senses blurred, not faded but merged. Sight, touch, memory, and presence became one medium, and within it, the garden revealed its final memory. He saw the first warden, not in image, but in essence a being woven from flame and song, who had once stood where Kaelin now stood. The first had not failed out of malice or error, but out of dissonance. The garden had tried to evolve too rapidly through him skipping steps in its growth. In reaching for transcendence before integration, it had ruptured its own core. That trauma had closed the deep chamber, had ended the first era of the sanctum. But Kaelin was different, not because he was stronger, wiser, or more compliant, but because he listened, he responded. He yielded not out of weakness, but of choice. And the garden in turn had evolved not in isolation, but in relationship. The Elicore bloom pulsed now, not as an organ, but as a threshold. Kaelin understood. The sanctum was ready to transform again, not into a sanctuary or a vault, but into a seed of propagation. It no longer wished to remain hidden on Velon 4. It had healed. It had learned. Now it wished to grow beyond its walls, not through conquest, not through replication, but through resonance. It wanted to be carried, not physically, but through the mind and memory of its warden, through Kaelin. He would become its vessel, its keeper of transmission, its next garden. And this was why it had called him. Not to remain here as prisoner or steward, but to become the thing that could never again be contained. To hold the sanctum within himself not as location, but as principle, as possibility, as memory made seed. When the bloom's pulse settled back into rhythm and the canopy reopened, Kaelin emerged changed. He no longer wondered whether he had a future beyond the dome. He carried the dome now. It lived within him, its memory etched into the neural lattice of his spinal cord, its root signals encoded in the microflora of his skin. He was a vector, a living extension of something once broken, now whole. He found Zelvira waiting by the spiral bridge. She said nothing, but her gaze held no mystery. She had known all along. She had been waiting for the garden to decide and for Kaelin to hear it. As he walked toward her, the garden stirred behind him, not in farewell, but in readiness. He was not leaving. He was carrying. And the sanctum would never be alone again. The moment of departure was not marked by ceremony. No petals closed behind him. No gates slammed shut. No ethereal voice called out across the wind. The sanctum vitae had no need for farewells. It had already imprinted itself root and bloom into Kaelin Varn's being. He did not leave the garden, he became its extension. And in the stillness of the spiral grove beneath the canopy of soft gold leaves that had grown luminous in response to his last passage, Kaelin stepped away, not as a visitor or even a warden, but as something entirely new. He did not carry tools or technology. His suit, long since absorbed and restructured by the garden's adaptive mycelium, was now a second skin of living fiber, breathing with him, shifting to match temperature, pressure, and emotional state. Every cell of his body pulsed with quiet data. The sanctum had written itself into his biology not as a parasite, but as a partner. Its memory lived in his bones. Its visions spoke through his thoughts. And in his chest, where once there had been uncertainty and resistance, there was now only stillness. Beyond the canopy, Velon 4 stretched vast and unyielding, a world of ash winds, glinting canyons, and cracked salt plains. The garden's dome shimmered at his back like a distant aurora, but he no longer looked to it for guidance. His path would not return there. That part of the garden's evolution was complete. Now it had to spread not through conquest, not through replication, but through presence. Each step Kaelin took was an extension of that purpose. The landscape did not welcome him. Storms stirred on the horizon and the sun's twin arcs offered little warmth, but he did not need comfort. The garden within him adapted. His cells buffered solar radiation with pigments the sanctum had cultivated from starlight. His lungs filtered the chemical winds with microbiota gifted by root blossoms. His heartbeat remained calm even as the terrain resisted him. He walked for days. He crossed crater shelves, edged along mineral ridges that rang when stepped upon, past geysers that hissed with iridescent vapor. The sanctum remained quiet in his mind, not absent, but watchful, letting him choose the path. There was no map, no coordinates, only instinct, until he came upon the ruins. They lay half-submerged in an obsidian basin, black towers cracked by age and seismic warping. The architecture was non-human fluid in structure, curving as if molded by heat and gravity rather than built by hand. He descended without hesitation. The garden within him responded immediately, vibrating through the roots of his spine like a tuning fork struck in the dark. The memory embedded in the ancient stone, long since dormant, responded in kind. This had once been a vessel too, a garden of another kind. But it had failed. Kalen knelt beside a collapsed pylon, its surface scarred by time and silence. The moment his fingers touched the stone, the echo reached upward, not in sound, but in sensation. A signal brief and broken. The ruins had once housed a sentient biome much like the sanctum, but unlike the Vitae, this one had not been preserved. It had tried to bind itself to something incompatible, something too rigid, too mechanized. And so it had withered, becoming an echo chamber of what could have been. The sanctum pulsed in him, gently acknowledging the loss. And then without force it reached. Not to revive the ruin, but to honor it. Kalen closed his eyes and let the garden's breath pass through him. Vines did not sprout from the earth. No new structures formed. Instead, the pollen of memory stored in Kalen's own breath, his skin, his footsteps, released itself in silent offering. It did not overwrite. It seeded. It mingled with the ancient dust, entering fractures, clinging to stone, whispering nothing more than the possibility of harmony. Then he moved on. Ruins became markers. On every new ridge, he found evidence of what had once been fragments of ecosystems built to remember, to teach, to endure. Most had failed, their designs too singular, too rigid, or too afraid to yield. The sanctum's gift was not perfection, but listening. And Kalen, as its living extension, carried that posture with him wherever he walked. He began to sense changes in the world around him. Beasts that once stalked him in shadow now paused in stillness, their breath sinking unconsciously to his presence. Dead canyons that never bloomed now bore strange algae shimmering faintly with bioluminescent threads. Even the wind patterns began to bend, slightly shifting in frequency to avoid his path, as though respecting a resonance they did not yet comprehend. He was no longer simply a man in motion. He was fertile gravity. At the edge of a long-forgotten salt basin, Kalen stopped. The terrain was dry, cracked like ancient skin, lifeless in every direction. But his senses tingled not with threat, but with invitation. He knelt and pressed his palm into the dust, and the sanctum responded. Not with bloom or eruption, but with stillness. The ground did not split. The sky did not shimmer. But far below the surface, a network began to form. Invisible, slow, patient. Kalen's presence had left behind spores, fragments of memory of instruction. Over days, weeks, decades, perhaps they would germinate. They would not recreate the sanctum. That had never been the goal. But they would remember it, echo it, build something new suited for this place. He moved on again. Over time, other signs began to appear, not just in the environment, but in the sky. Small signals, orbital movements, distant scanners pulsing in patterns too precise to be weather phenomena. The outside world had found traces of him, of the garden. Whether they came as rescuers, invaders, or explorers, Kalen could not yet know. But he was not afraid. The sanctum had never taught fear, only patience, only growth. He climbed the summit of a basaltic ridge during the third cycle of the moon's turning, his body now fully harmonized to Velan 4's gravity. At the peak, he stood beneath the unfiltered starlight, no dome, no petals, no guiding structure. And still he felt surrounded, supported, whole. The garden had grown beyond itself. It now walked in him, and in every step he took, he carried it further. It would bloom again, not because it demanded space, but because it had earned it. Through listening, through grief, through trust. And one day others would come, not to find Kalen Varn, but to follow what he left behind. Not footprints, but resonance. A hum in the soil, a pulse in the wind, a quiet invitation in the pollen that drifted across the dead plains, waiting for breath, for memory, for life. He would not be remembered as a gardener. He would be remembered as a threshold. And when the next being lost, longing, unaware, stepped through the veil of vines in some distant future, they would feel it too. The garden's breath. The keeper's echo. The beginning. Long after the dust settled, when the last echo of Kalen Varn's footsteps faded beneath the shifting winds of Velan 4, the seeds he left behind continued their silent work. No monuments bore his name. No records in human archives detailed his journey. But those who wandered far enough, who dared to listen rather than conquer, would find strange blossoms in the most barren places, vines that shimmered with knowledge, roots that sang in silence, air that pulsed with memory not their own. And in the quiet where starlight met soil, they would feel a presence, not a god, not a ghost, but a rhythm, a resonance, something once forgotten, something now alive, something that had learned to grow not by force, but by trust. Kalen Varn had not saved the garden. He had become its voice, and now, through the lives it touched, it would never be silenced again. If you felt something stir within you while listening to this story, if a part of you heard the garden breathe, then stay with us. Subscribe to the channel for more journeys across stars, soil, memory, and becoming. This is only one seed among many, and the next story may already be reaching out to you.